Welcome to Et al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, folks. My name is Siggelkow, and I am a proud author at Baylor University Press, publishing a book, hopefully in the next year, in 2026, called Apocalyptic and the Call to Freedom, which is a book on the New Testament theologian Ernst Käsemann. I have been the director at United Theological Seminary for a center called the Leadership Center for Social Justice, and I've done that for the last few years, and I also teach at the University of St. Thomas in their Justice and Peace Studies program. I'm an ordained Mennonite minister, and I have known Tyler for quite some time. Tyler and I went to school together at Princeton Seminary, met there almost, I think, 15 years ago. So, I'm really happy to be in conversation with my friend Tyler about his book, and then also I want to talk a bit about my book, but we'll see where the conversation goes. Tyler, who are you?
Yeah. It's good to be with you, Rye. It's good to be talking with you. So I'm Tyler Davis. I work at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. I work both as an administrator, a research administrator, supporting external grants and sponsored projects across the university. And I also teach in the Department of Theology and also in the Mexican American Studies program. I'm an affiliate faculty with the Center for Catholic Studies, and also try to support Center for Mexican American Studies, which is new as of this fall, as much as I can. So yeah, it's good to be here and talking with you. We might be doing something slightly atypical for this podcast, which is we're trying to talk about two books. The book that I recently was editor for, that was published by Baylor University Press last February, God of the Whirlwind, Horror, Memory, and Story in Black Waco, and then the project that you're currently working on. So yeah, it's good to be with you, Ray. Where should we start?
Well, I'd like to talk about your book since it's already published and it's so fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you about it. And the book, as you said, is God of the Whirlwind, Horror, Memory, and Story in Black Waco. You edited it. The foreword is written by Stevie Walker-Webb and photographs by Mark Menivar. And, just kind of, it's an unusual book. It's published through the 1845 Books imprint at Baylor University Press, which I know has a specific imprint that they do. It has images in color, beautiful photographs of people, portraits, and it's really a collection of stories from around Waco among Black Wacoans. The book is split up into three parts. Part one, The Storm, with two stories that follow by LaRue Dorsey and Linda Jen Lewis. Part two is Story, with Michael Babers, Betty Beard, Nona Kirkpatrick, and Anthony Fulbright. And then part three is called Spirit, which includes chapters and reflections from Ramad Carter, George Oliver, and Stevie Walker-Webb. And then the book closes with a really beautiful epilogue called The Spirit of the Whirlwind, and some notes about editing practices and kind of how you went about this project and went about the interviewing of these folks. I might just, before I ask you to talk about the book, Tyler, I think I might just read the beginning of the introduction because I think it really frames sort of what the book is about. And I think that's important because not everyone will know immediately what this book is about. It's about Waco, yes, but what's it about concretely? Well, Tyler says in the introduction, the May 1916 lynching of Jesse Washington, the total human catastrophe W.E.B. Du Bois famously called the Waco Horror, marks the nadir of racist violence in Central Texas, as the 17-year-old Black teenager and farm laborer was publicly lynched in downtown Waco. 37 years later, in May of 1953, a tornado paved a pathway of destruction through the city, upending a local legend of safety, which held that Waco was protected from natural disaster by the arms of God, the Brazos River, which I realize Brazos means arms, right? In Spanish.
Yeah, the Brazos de Dios.
Yeah. The damage was catastrophic. 114 people died and thousands were injured. So the book is about both this total human catastrophe of the lynching of Jesse Washington in Waco in May of 1916 that many people have heard of through Du Bois and his relatively, I think, famous essay, at least as it comes to his reflections on the United States and lynching. and Southern violence. And then it connects this date with May of 1953, the same month, but 37 years later, and this tornado. And this connection was made by the local community there. And you share about that beautifully in your introduction. And then we hear from people themselves about their experiences of either the tornado or the storytelling tradition of the tornado, the legacy of the lynching of Jesse Washington, the ongoing racialized forms of terror that are still present in Texas and in Waco, but also stories of resistance and courage and risk-taking and community building. I'm wondering, Tyler, I guess, if you could share a bit more about the book's origins. I know that this book came out of your dissertation, and we've had a lot of time to talk about that over the years. I remember you telling me about this when you first began your PhD at Baylor, that this was what you wanted to write on, this story that's told among Black Wacoans. And you did, in fact, write a dissertation on it. And I know this book kind of, in many ways, reflects the learning from the dissertation and then moving to actually doing these close interviews, close listening, and wanting to create a space for these stories to be shared. And I think you've done that really well. But I wonder if you could speak to the origins of it a little bit more, perhaps even a bit about the dissertation, kind of what were the questions that were, like, why did this book draw you? Why did this topic, the story, draw you in so much?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ryan. Thanks for reading the opening, which I think helps frame the kind of broad topic, right, that the book is about, which is, again, the lynching of Jesse Washington in 1916, which Du Bois, as you mentioned, wrote about. And I think he wrote about it, we can say, at least two times. One in the Crisis magazine of the NAACP did a report, an on-the-ground investigative report led by Elizabeth Freeman in the aftermath of the lynching. And this is where Du Bois used the term the Waco Horror to write about it. And, this lynching would become part of the NAACP's national campaign against lynching before the First World War. The images that were taken of the lynching were recirculated in the pages of the Crisis as part of that campaign, even though they were initially taken for nefarious and gruesome purposes, and they were these kind of racist images of violence, and then they were taken up by the NAACP and used in that campaign. But he also wrote a second time in his fiction, in the short story Jesus Christ in Texas, where he talks about Jesus Christ appearing in Waco, Texas. It happened in Waco, Texas is the first line of that. So yeah, he wrote about it twice. But this book begins in some ways in 1916, although I think the larger history goes before that, which we try to point to in the introduction. And it's connected to this tornado in 1953, which is this interesting moment where memory is transformed, because as you read the story that is told in Waco, which I heard when I was living in Waco for the first time. I've lived there in two different times in my life. When I was living there the first time, I learned about this story when I was working at a nonprofit in North Waco. And the story is that the tornado of 1953, one of the worst tornadoes in the history of Texas, that the tornado's path of destruction followed the path that Jesse Washington's body was lynched. And then some versions and iterations of this story, are theological. And they say that, this was a moment of divine justice where there had been human injustice. Here was a moment 37 years after the lynching of Jesse Washington. Here was a moment of divine justice. I heard it in the context of learning about the history of a place I had recently moved to, learning about the history of Jesse Washington. And a friend, Stevie Walker Webb, who's part of this project, shared with me that story. And I think in sharing that story helped me see that these two moments in that local history are inseparable in the Black community. 1916 lynching of Jesse Washington is inseparable, or has become inseparable in local memory from the 1953 tornado. So I learned about it in that context. I went away, and we've already mentioned our time in Princeton. And after Princeton, I ended up back in Waco in a graduate program. And the story is one that stuck with me. And I think that specifically theological versions of it were of such interest that I decided to make it the focus of my dissertation research. So I wrote a dissertation on this project, thinking about this story conceptually, right? Trying to make sense of, why I think it, was theologically powerful, and also why theology should be attentive to, I think, popular and oral and ordinary traditions as authoritative sources for theological knowledge making. And so that dissertation was thinking about those questions and about the power of naming God in history, of saying that tornado, that was a moment of divine justice, and why that matters. And so that was a kind of second iteration of my encounter with it. The first was just hearing and being struck by it. The second was writing a dissertation about it. And then a few years later, through the Crossroads Project and resources made available by the Crossroads Project in African American religion, based at Princeton University, there's a kind of third iteration, which was moving from dissertation and thinking about it theologically to talking to the folks who tell this story, who carry it. And that's what that's where this book comes from. This is not the dissertation revised for a book. This is based in conversations with people who carry memories of lynching and memories of the tornado and their imbrication. And so this book is kind of born of conversations and interviews. So it's a book of oral histories. That's background is in kind of a theological concern with an important ordinary local tradition. So that's a bit about the book and background and the kind of iterations.
Yeah.
And yeah,
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, as we met in 2012, and I'm thinking about that as an important date because I believe that is also the same year that James Cone published his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong on that. It was around that time.
I think it's right around there. I think it might be 2011.
Of course, that was a project that he worked on for quite some time, a project that emerged from his own personal history, and kind of he speaks to that as sort of something he had to deal with, kind of a personal wrestling. But it also, part of, I think, Cone's contribution to theological studies, through whether it's through the spirituals and the blues, that text, or The Cross and the Lynching Tree, is taking seriously the theologies of ordinary people and the theologies of people in struggle, especially, but looking at music, looking at prayers, and trying to sort of discern and lift up, right, these other forms of theology, we might say, from below. And I think, it's interesting because, we studied at Princeton Seminary, and of course, there's a legacy there that Cone has through teachers like Nancy Duff and Beverly Gaventa and Jim Kay, all of whom were students or connected to Union Seminary and Cone, the kinds of conversations that have been going on throughout that time. And I'm thinking about this question around revelation and authority. And, one of the debates that people had, or some of the disagreements that they had with Cone, had to do with the question of authority. What constitutes authorities for theology, right? The Bible is an authority for theology. Tradition's an authority for theology. Is experience an authority for theology? Well, for many of the people at Princeton that we learned from, the language of experience was associated with a certain kind of liberal Protestantism that, we were trained to sort of oppose or to be suspicious of, and instead, toward more of a theology of revelation from Karl Barth. And so I guess I'm wondering about this question of authority and speech about God and ordinary discernment in everyday life, like naming God's activity in the weather. Like how do we understand, I guess, that as a source for speech about God?
I appreciate that. I mean, I think Karen Fields, the late Karen Fields, a social theorist, translator of Durkheim, she recently passed. She has, I mean, if we're ranking just essays that you remember years later, right? Scholarly essays that just stick with you. She has maybe the one that stuck with me the longest, this essay with the great title, What One Cannot Remember Mistakenly. And it's an essay about an oral history project she conducted in South Carolina with her grandmother. And it's about memory. And she says in that essay that when we think of memory, one of the first things that we often talk about is how memory fails us. But she came to understand her work through that project as how oral history can bear witness to the way memory succeeds, right? And that the ways that memory succeeds should be given attention, and just as much attention at least as the way that memory fails. And so I came to think of this project, as working in alignment kind of with that idea that memory succeeds. And one of the ways that memory has succeeded in Waco is the transmission and retelling of this story and all of its iterations with people who have carried it across generations. I'm glad that you named the folks that are included in this volume, because they come from different generations. And so with those generations have different relationships to the story in question. But it's a book about the way memory has succeeded in the different ways memory can succeed. And so when I think about this question of, theology and experience and how experience can be a source of theology, I think closely related to experience is memory. And this book, I think, is a way of trying to say that, memory is a source of theology as a way of remembering our experiences of structural injustices and sins, like the kind of background of plantation slavery and plantation power and lynching right? And memories of those are theologically significant, but also theologically significant as memories of how God intervened and disrupted those histories as well. And I think that's part of the story. So yeah, the book I think is maybe a kind of footnote to Karen Fields trying to say, memory succeeds and memory is theologically significant, right? In its success in that way.
I mean, I think my question, is probably more oriented toward the dissertation, because that's kind of the question that like was raised for you theologically, and what you wanted to work out in the dissertation is like, how do we value this kind of ordinary theological speech, but more to the point, how do we understand God's activity in history and our naming of it? Can we actually name? Is that something? And I think in the dissertation, I know you kind of were like, actually, a lot of theology doesn't want to name God's action in history, like actually actively avoids it. I mean, it might speak of God's action in history in vague terms, in general terms, or maybe, with the Brazos River, right? It's like the arms of God. Like these are sort of providential terms of how we think about creation in relation to God. And of course, in the weather, there's a long tradition of thinking about, this is an act of God, right? Like a natural disaster. I guess I'm wondering about, what you think about that. Or like, is that right? That this has kind of been one of the problems you've been trying to address throughout your work?
Yeah, I think so. I think, some of the theology that I was, very influenced by has been critical of, especially, modern and certain forms of political theology has been critical of speaking about God in specific and concrete circumstances. And the reason it's been critical of that is because it has a historical consciousness of the ways in which speaking about God specifically and in concrete circumstances has been used as a justification for all kinds of violence, right? I mean, this since we're talking about the weather,
Yeah.
we could think about some of the stuff that emerged after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, right? And yeah, popular preachers like I think Pat Robertson spoke about it as divine judgment, and I think there was like a Louisiana congressman at the same time who did as well. And in those cases, right? I mean, it seems hideous and problematic, and so it makes sense why we should be skeptical of speaking about God in those ways. What was interesting to me about this story is that here is a kind of story of a historically oppressed group of people, Black Wacoans, who spoke about God concretely in their time and place as a way of retelling the history of where they lived and contesting dominant narratives that were used to oppress them. And so it's a kind of homegrown liberation theology in a way that depends upon speaking about God very concretely in history. And so I was interested in that kind of affirmative dimension, the need to name God, and how naming of God can be a tool in struggle for people to contest unjust order, right? And I think that's what drew me to this story. And that I think you see in the book God of the Whirlwind, but you also see others who have different kinds of relationships to it. Betty Beard, who grew up surrounded by this story, is also suspicious of it too. She says we don't, necessarily need stories today. We need facts. What happened? Let's tell history through facts. So I think the book has a kind of multiplicity of memories and recollections and stories about this one story that I was drawn to. So I think it's important to keep that in mind too. The closer I got to this one story, which was the basis for this book, the more a kind of multiplicity of perspectives emerged too.
Interesting to think about this, because it's like, in some ways, it seems like the conclusion that you were kind of moving toward, or maybe this book just is the conclusion of what you set out to do in your dissertation, in the sense that to truly value, right, and take seriously this tradition would be to allow it to speak, as it were, and have a weightiness to it, to give it space. And I think that taking it so seriously as an important sort of source for theology, the naming of God concretely in history, that led you actually to the concreteness of this book, right? And the careful interviews that you did, the photographs, the attention to the community. So I almost see this as like a way to sort of, and maybe that's the answer to the question that I was asking you, almost like this itself is a demonstration of valuing histories from below, valuing theologies from below, and not just saying we value them, right? But actually doing something with that creatively, which I think you've done well. And it strikes me as really a mode though of, it's a different kind of almost methodology for theology. It's, it's about listening, right? I mean, it's a book of listening. I mean, when you enter the book, it feels like you're sitting down for story times, right? Like over a cup of coffee or tea or something with the people themselves. So it seems like you want people to encounter these stories almost in the ways that you have, or as living stories that have the power to do something, to change something.
Yeah, that's great. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I do think, yeah, I mean, there's a way in which this project did become a project where it's like, okay, here's this tradition that I want to understand and think through theologically. But then the next step was not to say, write a book about that. The next step was to listen to the people who have told the story, sometimes told the story, not told the story, and then told it after they heard it, or who tell it loudly, so yeah, I do appreciate the idea that it might be thought of as, theology shifting, to a kind of listening, to
Yeah.
a kind of listening posture. And I think that was when I look at this book today, I think of interviews where I sat down, in the places that I sat down and talked with people who were graciously willing to share their memories and their stories with me. But then I think of ongoing conversations too, right? This is not just those interviews. This is the result of ongoing kind of conversations too. Like the chapters reflect conversations about our conversation with the people that are in the book, and kind of an ongoing editing and, the kind of work that goes into shifting an oral recorded interview into a chapter, right? That involved working with everyone a second, at time, and talking through everything. Yeah, there's listening and there's conversation, right? And it's kind of ongoing. And that's what I see with this book in a way now. Yeah, I don't know. I appreciate those comments. I'm glad you brought up James Cone. I think for me, when I think of this project too, it is sort of in some ways unimaginable apart from The Cross and Lynching Tree, published it was 2011, right around that time you were saying. And that was around the time I first encountered this tradition, and then later, right, wrote this tradition, and then leading to this book, God of the Whirlwind. And in many ways, this is a book that makes sense of Cone drawing attention to the lynching tree as the scene of the cross in Golgotha, right, in the United States. And so trying to make sense of that, and so the book is an attempt to sort of listen to those who have been theologizing from the lynching tree, and doing so through, this kind of local history of struggle. But I think that's, James Cone's a nice touch point, I think, to also talk about your book and your project that you're working on with Baylor. So this book has been published, came out last February, but you're working on a project right now on Ernst Käsemann that has a connection to Cone. You wrote a dissertation, you also have published a book that's a translation of his work called Church Conflicts, which contains a foreword from James Cone in it. And I know that you're interested in Käsemann and James Cone's relationship. Yeah, so maybe just to start with, can you talk about this project that you're working on, that you've been working on?
Well, I mean, it makes me think of, again, like those early years when we first met, because I think it was 2011, after the book was published, The Cross and Lynching Tree, that one of the groups at AAR, the theology and apocalyptic group, had a book forum on it that was later published in Theology Today, and it was quite an experience, quite a momentous event for lots of reasons. But I think for me personally, I at the time had been reading Ernst Käsemann. I was interested in these conversations, these explorations into theology. I have been part of that group at AR since its very beginning in 2008 or 2009 as a young graduate student. And then when I got to PTS to do my PhD, I was drawn to doing something on Ernst Käsemann. And of course, this was then connected to Cone by the fact that we had this book forum on the topic of apocalyptic and the Cross and Lynching Tree. But at that meeting, I distinctly remember Cone getting angry. Something that he said was he said that the entire field of biblical studies has historically been a racist field. And I thought, wow, that's a big statement. And then he says, with one exception, Ernst Käsemann, out of nowhere. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? And that was around the same time that Ernst Käsemann's book that was translated by Roy Harrisville and called Being a Disciple of the Crucified Nazarene, which is a book of collection of essays that Käsemann had not published yet. And so really wonderful, a wonderful book, but that was published at the same time. So I had been reading that actually at the same AAR conference where Cohn mentioned Käsemann as being that exception to the rule of racism in biblical studies. And I began to then dig in more deeply into Käsemann's work and specifically on some of these questions around racism and his understanding of racism, and discovered that Cohn and Käsemann had a friendship. And he would later articulate this to me through a series of emails before his death, where he had long actually wanted to write about Ernst Käsemann, but no one had ever asked him to. But he had a very deep relationship with him, almost like a heart connection, where he says they kind of share the same struggle in their work. And I think to myself, well, what does that mean? What does it mean for Ernst Käsemann to be part of this shared struggle with James Cohn? And I think part of what my work has been about in terms of trying to recover Käsemann's theology, but also this book that I'm working on now, which is really becoming sort of a theological biography of sorts of Käsemann's life within the context of the 20th century, is sort of trying to make these connections between what Käsemann was on about in terms of the struggle against Nazism, the confessing church, his theology that emerges there, and how that relates to or does not relate to, or what are the connections, I guess, to Jim Crow Arkansas, and thinking about fascism then across time and space, but also the concrete historical connections to, not just in an abstract sense, but like actually the material connections between different places. And then part of that story is that Ernst Käsemann's daughter, Elizabeth, was actually at the time when Cohn and Käsemann met in Tübingen, she was in Argentina at that point. And if people don't know, they can look her up and learn more about her. But Elizabeth was kidnapped by the military dictatorship and was tortured for several weeks and then was actually murdered. And I think Roy Harrisville writes about how there were swastikas on the walls where she was tortured. And this was in Buenos Aires. So I'm thinking, and Cohn reflects on this when he wrote to me about that connection, about the sense of shared struggle. So what does Elizabeth have to do, and her struggle in Latin America, and of course the people of Latin America that she was struggling alongside during that era, have to do with the struggle against fascism in Nazi Germany, have to do with Jim Crow Arkansas? Where are these connections being made? And what is this friendship? What was shared between them? And I think that's been the big question that's preoccupied me and has led in many different directions. It's led me to a deeper historical analysis, I suppose, of fascism. And it's led me to a deeper historical analysis of historiography of the 20th century. Especially around questions of memory, actually. How do we remember the Holocaust? How has that memory been mobilized in New Testament studies and Paul studies? How did Käsemann wrestle with these questions? Käsemann has been criticized by some scholars for anti-Jewish tropes, using anti-Jewish tropes. And so I'm trying to address that in the book as well. And so trying to push back against a certain narrative about his interpretation of the New Testament, of his interpretation of Paul in particular. Of course, he's famous for having said, Apocalyptic was the mother of all Christian theology. And he's had a tremendous influence in Pauline studies over the last several decades, especially through the work of his dear friend, J. Lewis Martin, who taught at Union for such a long time, and through Martin's students. So I'm recovering Käsemann. I'm placing him and situating him in historical context, and I am sort of reading his life and theology as an entry point or a kind of prism into thinking about a theological method, but also addressing fascism today as well. So what did Käsemann learn from his experiences in some ways and the connections that he made? And of course, connecting with Cohn was really important to him. And I think for Cohn, especially, what was really important about Käsemann, not only was it his commitments that he shared with him, but I think also his theology of the cross. And that plays an important role both his Theology of the Cross and his critiques of Rudolf Bultmann on the question of the historical Jesus play a really important role in Cohn's own theological imagination and evolution. We see that reflected in his works.
So you mentioned 2011. I feel like we started this, and the theme of this podcast might be 2011, 2012. We've been talking about that a bit. It's the year James Cone published Across the Lynching Tree. We met at PTS. In some ways, this was very formative for these projects that we're now both working on or completing. But I think a lot has happened, right, since that AAR you mentioned in 2011. You did write a dissertation about Ernst Käsemann, and you completed a translation project called Church Conflicts, and you've worked in ministry and, taught in seminaries and universities and, worked in community organizing. And what has persisted for you is this interest in Käsemann. So I guess maybe that's interesting to me, right?
Sure.
So maybe I guess I would like to ask,
Can't shake it.
Yeah. I mean, because I feel this way about this book in some ways, right? It was a kind of story that I heard and that hooked me. And then I just, kept thinking about it in different ways and talking to folks about it. So yeah, I guess I wonder what still interests you in Käsemann on this side and how that's shaping the project.
Yeah, Käsemann, went with me to the pulpit, when I was a pastor. Certainly, he shaped how I approached ministry. He shaped sort of how I thought so much. And I always felt like he was there with me, or a friend. And so I think that's part of it. He's been kind of an ongoing interlocutor for me. But I think part of it too has been the more that I've learned, I guess, about what's going about 20th century history, the more that I've learned about social struggles through my involvement in them. I've been able to then come to a better understanding of what Käsemann was doing, perhaps. And his life is just incredibly fascinating. It's an unbelievable life that he lived. He stands at sort of, his life spans the entire 20th century. He grows up in Essen, which is a part of Germany in the early 20th century that was the kind of run by the Krupp family. And the Krupp family, they were weapons producers, weapons manufacturers primarily. So Essen becomes sort of this symbol of industrial capitalism, of militarism, of the arms industry, but it also becomes the center for Nazism, and it became a stronghold for Nazism. At the same time, in Essen, you have movements from below, movements among workers, particularly people working doing steel work and working in the coal mines, and amazing resistance movements that emerge throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. It's also a place where people were starving during the war. And Käsemann himself was starving during the war. I think it was 1917 or 1918's time, in that time period in Essen, where people could only eat turnips for an entire year. There was one year where they only ate rutabagas. And in town, they would have, in the newspapers, they'd have recipes for different ways to make things out of rutabagas, because how can you live on just rutabagas, right? So Käsemann grew up in this very difficult situation. His father died in World War I when Käsemann was only 9 years old. In 1915. And then through the war, during his kind of adolescence, it's just devastation in Essen. And then, he's drawn into the church through the youth movement, and a particular youth pastor, kind of a charismatic figure that he was drawn to. And, the future was grim for many of the youth in Essen, and so I think he found stability there and belonging. He says that it was also where he discovered that a Lord to commit himself to, and began to see that we all in some ways belong to or serve a Lord, serve something. And he felt strongly about being called into ministry. So he goes to do his theological education. And then 1933, the same month that Hitler came to power, Käsemann takes a position as pastor of a church in Gelsenkirchen Rothausen, which was very near Essen, where he'd grown up. And he is just sort of thrown into this. This is literally within weeks of Hitler came to power. And so you have then his pastoral ministry that runs through 1933 to 1945 or 46, that time, which is again the time period of Nazism. And you see a dramatic transformation take place. Käsemann, like many youth, not just youth, but like many people in the church we know, voted for Hitler. he was actually engaged in some of the work of the German Christians early on. He was interested in this because he believed the propaganda. And his teacher Bultmann was very concerned about this, and he did write to Käsemann about this. And then something shifts in him, and so I'm trying to understand that shift, because by the end of 33 and into 34, Käsemann joins the Confessing Church and becomes sort of the left wing of the Confessing Church, the most radical side of the Confessing Church, that was uncompromising and just refused compromise with the German Christians. In 1934, Käsemann publicly excommunicated the German Christians from his congregation, and he replaced them with Confessing Church Christians. During this time, though, like, the church was under attack, under surveillance. Käsemann was under surveillance. 1937, Käsemann is arrested and spends about a month in prison. He actually found this to be a nice break from his pastoral duties. And so during that time, he writes a commentary on Hebrews. And Käsemann's work is read by people today, right? People read the commentary in Hebrews even today as an authoritative or canonical text. They read his Romans commentary. They read his work for its exegetical and historical critical insights. Not that it's always still accurate. I mean, people have critiques of what he had said, but he's had such a tremendous influence, and continues to be read. And I think part of what I'm trying to do is sort of say, well, why is he so preoccupied with writing a commentary in prison on Hebrews, right? Like, during this just absurdly insane period of history and his own life. What's he writing about? Because later he'll say, that book's really a commentary on the Confessing Church. What does he mean by that? What was his relation to the Confessing Church? What was at stake in these debates, between the left wing of the Confessing Church and more moderate or conservative circles? And Victoria Barnett has been a helpful resource as I've been kind of navigating some of this literature. But what you see is just a really fascinating, not only during that period, but then at the end of the war, he actually is drafted into the war, taken from his congregation 2 different times. At the end of the war, he's captured by the United States military and is put into effectively a concentration camp. It wasn't even designated as a POW camp. It was mostly women and children and some soldiers, and thousands of people died there. They call it the Field of Misery, and there's a memorial for it in Germany. And so his experience then living in a concentration camp, where his job in this camp was to throw dead bodies over barbed wire. He leaves after the war ends. He's released, goes back to his home, and what does he discover? Well, the entire city has been bombed. Essen and Gelsenkirchen, Rothausen. These were sites for strategic bombings, and it was just blown out. And so this affects your exegesis. This affects your interpretation of Scripture, and so that's kind of what I'm trying to look into, that, like, how these life events, what's happening historically, what's happening in Käsemann's life, how it has shaped his thinking. Not a psychologizing reading of him, but really how many of his essays and his points of concentration, whether that's reflections on the Lord's Supper or the canon or the historical Jesus, that many of these things are the ways that Käsemann is trying to work out these very real, concrete issues that he's trying to sort out in real time. So I continue to love him, and I continue to learn from him. And I continue to seek more and more connections, I suppose, about how his legacy is intertwined with so many others, including the World Council of Churches, which he spoke at on a couple of occasions, and had a big influence on their understanding of the church and Scripture. And his being deeply impacted by the West German student movement, which his daughter was a core part of, and his own students, many of whom were students of color, students that had come from the so-called Third World and were studying with him. He began to have this sort of global imagination about both the forces of evil, fascism, the demonic powers that possess the earth, but also the forces for liberation and the gospel as a liberating word, and the importance of concrete discernment, of discerning the spirits in history, in life, in ministry, in Scripture, in that kind of concreteness. I guess is there's a similarity there with discernment. Mm-hmm. To go back to that earlier point of conversation.
Yeah, so much. Yeah, it's I don't know. Hearing you speak about it, there's clearly so much happening in Käsemann's life that continues to draw you back. And Yeah, I mean, any one of those moments, I mean, it sounds like incredibly rich historical context, but also this idea of, reading some of his works, which have been appreciated, but reading them in context and how that helps you appreciate sort of the ways he was trying to understand his own present
Yeah. We're
and
still
how that might
wrestling with
not
these
be,
issues.
yeah, and how it might
That's what
not be
he
fully
was
appreciated.
exposing, right? I mean, he thought that he thought that the German church, the radical side of the confessing church, was buried in 1945. And he thought that the church had completely sold out to U.S. imperialism, that the church had become complicit in, global capitalism and white supremacy. He starts talking about the white man in his later work. And I, when I first read that, I was like, a German theologian using kind of the language of Malcolm X, a New Testament theologian, that is not common. That is not a common sight. So that's that I think has also been what led me to dig more deeply into and to value these experiences in this history.
You're clearly very, you're doing this work and you spent this time with Käsemann and you're reconstructing a life, but at the same time, you're reconstructing, you know, commitments that matter.
Yes.
And so, yeah, maybe that gets us back to the title. Why, at least right now, right? You could, yeah, you could, of course, can always change the title, but it's called Apocalyptic and the Call to Freedom, right?
Yeah.
So that's up to me is maybe gets at the kind of Käsemann as prism, Käsemann as transparency, Käsemann as window to commitments, his commitments, but commitments that are, relevant beyond his own life.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if there's how would you summarize, or why that
I
title
mean,
so far?
So the Call to Freedom actually comes from the title of a book he wrote in the late 60s that was translated into English as Jesus Means Freedom. So but in German, it's called The Call to Freedom. That's a better translation. And that was a very controversial book. It went through several editions. But the more I've thought about Käsemann's work, the more I've come to understand that at the heart of it really is, for him, the heart of the gospel is the call to freedom. And it's a call. For Käsemann, it's a way, and that way is the freedom. I think Käsemann would say that it's freedom from prison. It's freedom from demonic powers, not necessarily freedom for. He's more pro freedom from, but it's also what it's freedom for is freedom for service in love, liberating service, liberating solidarity. It's a call that encounters us at the Lord's Supper. This is something he was trying to work out in the 30s. When you excommunicate people from your congregation, you're a Lutheran pastor, and you do it at the altar during the Lord's Supper, right? You think about that for years later, years after. And he did. And he was trying to figure out, well, how do you justify that theologically? I mean, how do you really, what is the Lord's Supper, right? For Paul, he wants to run it through Paul. How do we understand it in Paul? How do we understand the New Testament? And for him, really the Lord's Supper and the sacraments of the church, he comes to think, which he connects with baptism, they don't secure salvation. They actually call us to freedom. They call us into a way of life, a way of wandering. He'll speak of wandering, in this sort of image of wandering in the desert. It calls us to exodus, that is to break camp with traditions that are no longer useful. He uses that kind of as a metaphor. But that also means for him, it's a call to revolution. And so Käsemann became increasingly radical politically in the 70s and 80s, especially after Elizabeth was murdered, and supported revolutionary movements around the world, including ones that were happening in Germany among the Red Army faction, which was actually listed as a terrorist organization, a left-wing terrorist organization. But Käsemann was deeply connected to the kinds of concerns that they were raising about Germany's complicity in capitalism and in the arms industry and all this stuff. And of course, his daughter's own involvement with the student left-wing movement. So he ended up kind of he ends up articulating a theology of revolution, which is, again, he's one of the very few theologians from Germany that have done that. I mean, of course, Karl Marx did something like that. And he's very indebted to Marx, actually. And so I'm also trying to read him in conversation with kind of left traditions of Marxism, and also, of course, within his own a more immediate context, whether that's, the Tübingen school or whether that's Rudolf Bultmann at Marburg. Yeah. So anyway, call to freedom, liberation, freedom for others, freedom from demonic powers.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. Yeah. It's been great talking to you about it. thinking about, I think, not just thematic connections, but also just the time it takes to do some projects. In my case, it might just be that I think slowly, but I think there's a benefit to spending a lot of time with stuff too over the years, right? I'm thinking about 2011 and 2012 still. But yeah,
I think we've been in conversation for many years, and we've worked closely together. We've written an essay together on James Cone, actually, on this very question about the risks of doing theology, of speaking concretely about God's activity in the world. And we've both been drawn to this kind of work as part of, or as deeply connected to, this tradition of liberation theology. And so I've appreciated those conversations, but I'm also just want to sort of lift this book up. The God of the Whirlwind book is really just a marvelous sort of example of liberation theology in the wake of Cone's cross and the lynching tree, right? And kind of an extension. You call it kind of homegrown, but also like the serious. I guess I want to lift up and highlight just how serious it is. This earlier point I made, which is that to really listen. I guess theology is a mode of listening, is an art of listening and discernment, and has extremely important methodological implications in terms of how we do theology, right? And I think that you're showing us a new way, really, to kind of do theology. And part of that might mean where the theologian doesn't do much talking, but maybe opens up space for others to do talking, and not in a way that's like passive, though, right? Or not like, it's not, I hesitate to say this is a book about like sort of decentering or something like that, right? This is very much an active, you're very actively involved in this work, but it's a form of that sort of listening posture, I guess, and that I see kind of coming through in the text. So I think it's a methodological breakthrough, actually, in how we imagine liberation theology for the future.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm happy ending there. Yeah, I mean, that will be, what is the cliche at the end of these conversations is to say I'll be thinking about this for some time, but that is something, that I will be thinking about. Because, I mean, when you're in a project like that, I wasn't theologizing it actively. It was just, you're kind of doing it. And now on the side of things, you can do some reflection. So I appreciate that. And we look forward, I'll say we in the sense of everybody who listens, right? And looking forward to this really important work on Ernst Käsemann.
Thanks so much. It's been a great
thank you. Yeah.
Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.